Reading and interpreting a scientific paper is a skill which takes some time to develop. It's well over 10 years since I started my undergraduate degree, and while these days I'm pursuing a PhD, it can still be a bit of a minefield. One key point is that reading a scientific paper is not the same as reading a blog or a news article about science. If you don't take much away from this post, hopefully this part will stay in your thoughts. Now, there's a few different types of scientific paper that you may come across, such as meta-analyses, systematic reviews, primary research, or reviews and opinion pieces. Now, rather than go through all the different types of research paper, I'm going to concentrate in this video on peer-reviewed primary research, which is generally carried out to answer specific research questions or problems. Of course, this isn't to say that other research papers or other types of research paper have no use, which of course they do. But when we want to look at research questions, then primary research may be our very first port of call. I've put together some tips on reading and understanding a scientific paper for those who maybe don't have a scientific background or are just interested in developing their reading skills when reading or trying to interpret scientific literature. Generally, primary research papers will be split into sections, and we'll talk through these in a moment. The order of which these appear, though, may be different depending on the journal that has published the article, but we don't really need to worry about that. However, most sections will consist of an abstract, the introduction, the methods, the subsequent results, and the conclusion and/or discussion. Now, you might find it handy to have a highlighter pen or a notepad and pen handy when you're looking through a study, because there might be some sections that you want to go back to or refer to later on in your reading. So here are some tips that I've put together for when you're reading research papers. Don't really bother with the abstract to start with, and this might sound completely insane or bizarre, as it can be quite natural to read the abstract and assume that's all you need to know. However, the abstract is just a real snapshot of the paper itself. And if you're trying to formulate an argument, really just reading the abstract won't actually cut it, I'm afraid. Instead, read the introduction first. Yep, read the introduction first. By reading the introduction first, you can start to ask very important questions about the paper, whether it contributes or helps with what you're actually looking for, or maybe answer a question. When reading the introduction or background, as it's sometimes called, there are some questions that you can ask yourself, such as, what is this paper really about? Or is there a problem here that has been identified and needs solving? What you'll find in the introduction is pretty much the unravelling of a story, and subsequently more questions will arise as such. And the authors are really leading you into what they want you to read in their study. And that sounds quite simple. Has any previous work been done in this area, and actually what are the authors saying about it? They're almost trying to justify why they're doing this research. Are there any gaps in which the authors are identifying that actually lead to their research question? And what are they saying about these? It might be that the researchers are testing a hypothesis or hypotheses, and this is likely to be found at the end of the introduction, or at least in the last paragraph of the introduction or background. Now, the authors have set out their stall, and they've led you into their story with a really succinct introduction, which should help you set the scene. Now, onto arguably one of the most important parts of the paper, the methods. The methods can seem quite tricky for a lot of reasons, and for the purpose of this video, I wouldn't really expect you to be able to critique the methods by means of whether or not they can be replicated by other researchers and so on. However, possibly the best bit of advice I can give on the methods section is, can you explain what the authors did and how they collected the data to another? And that sounds really, really simple. And it is. It's really that simple. What did they do and how did they do it? For example, a paper might use a subjective rate of perceived exertion, or RPE, measurement to investigate, let's say, internal load. Now, the authors used a pen and paper for the RPE collection, multiplied the RPE by time in minutes to get a measure of internal load. And that's an example of explaining methods. Now, onto the results section, and maybe that's where the magic really happens, well, for some of us anyway. The first point of call for the results section is to summarise the results and then determine meaning. And this can seem a really daunting process for the non-scientist, but it is an important one. I find it useful to summarise the results section by writing it down in a few short sentences, and that's really normally enough. Depending on the paper type, there may be some graphs, tables or charts, and these shouldn't really be skipped over because they're equally as important as the written text, if not actually more important, as the authors are describing their results to you. The paper may also contain some really funky statistics, which I really wouldn't expect everyone to understand. I mean, I'm a PhD student and there's some statistical methods that I don't understand at the first glance and have to go and look up. So don't be worried about that. So again, don't be fazed by the jargon or what may appear to be these complex statistical analysis tools. It's quite a natural feeling to feel a little bit perplexed by those. One key point you may want to look out for when reading the results is, are the results significant or non-significant? And this is often stated in the results section and maybe more than once depending on the amount of variables and certainly in quantitative research. For qualitative research, the results may be related to a specific area in the results section and will be structured around the key themes that emerge from the analysis of the data. So the authors will tend to describe it to you rather than use statistical analysis. It's also worth paying attention to the sample size used by the researchers. And although you will tend to see larger sample size in quantitative research than qualitative, it isn't always the case. Once you've read through the results and maybe made some notes, you can start to use your own interpretation of the results. And again, this shouldn't seem too daunting. The key question here is, do the results answer the specific question? And actually, what is your interpretation of these results? Now, you might want to go back to the introduction section again and check the specific research question that the researcher or researchers have stated. Do the results answer the question or problem? It's now time to move on to the discussion section, or sometimes the conclusion, or both sections. And again, that will depend on the paper and the journal it's published in. So we'll generalise with this one. In this section, and more than likely the discussion section, the authors will begin to explain what the results mean to them. And this is where, if you've had some notes from the results section, you can really determine whether you agree with them or not. Towards the end of this section, you might see some limitations that the authors have acknowledged, and you may ask, well, do you agree with them? Can you think of anything else that may have limited the author's research or data collection or methods? Again, I'm not expecting you to critique methods like a reviewer, but it's worth knowing, can you think of anything else? Then you might see the authors proposing areas of research that may need further investigation in this area or the field. Do you agree with that? And if so, why? Or do you disagree with the authors? And that's fine too. Now, there's one section that we've skipped over at the start, and that was done on purpose, and that was the abstract. Now, it's time to go back to the start of the study and read the abstract. And then it's down to the final questions about the paper. Does it actually do what it says on the tin? In other words, does the abstract match what the researchers have done in their paper? And does it fit in with how you interpret the paper from your notes? And that's why it's really important to read the abstract last, to gain a deeper understanding of the paper instead of reading it first.